All right, so this lecture is going to be focusing on the competing perspectives that are brought up in the beginning of the chapter assigned for this week. So for those of you who have taken sociology courses in the past, whether it was the theory course or courses with me or the other faculty, one of the things that should have come up and that you probably have covered, and we will review here, is the term social constructionism. So social constructionism is essentially the heart of the discipline of sociology, right? So we're going to talk about that within the context of gender, and then its competing or opposing theoretical perspective, which is essentialism. But I'm going to talk about theory first because these are theoretical perspectives, all right? So just briefly reviewing what the concept of theory means, what it is and what it is not within the discipline of sociology. So one of the more, oh goodness, one of the more straightforward definitions of theory is that it's a set of statements or propositions. And what makes this different from an idea is that these statements or propositions are attempting to explain some kind of social phenomena, right? Or some kind of observation about the social world, right? So as opposed to your opinion or your idea of something, theory is really specifically talking about statements that are attempting to explain social phenomena. So this can get a little confusing because the term theory is misused all the time. You've probably heard people say it or even said it at some point, you know, like, oh, I have a theory about that, or I have, you know, what's your theory on this, right? And it really amounts to more like, you know, just kind of what do you think or sense is happening here, right? But when we're talking about sociological theory, and of course the theories that focus on gender, which is the focus of this class, it is specifically looking at patterns and events, phenomena, trends throughout society and developing these sets of statements that are attempting to explain them, right? So we also have to be able to test theory. So we're not going to focus on that so much in this class. That's really more within the realm of research methods, but that's definitely another hallmark of social theory. All right, so gender theories, even more specifically and narrowly, which are the focus of this class, are sets of statements that are designed to explain how individuals become gendered by society and other individuals. So I'm just going to stop right there and focus on just that particular part of the definition. So when we think about social constructionism and essentialism this week, and then we're going to talk about some other gender theories in the coming weeks, this is what you want to be looking for, right? So one of the key takeaways in your reading for this week and the following weeks when we're focusing on theory is you want to ask yourself, what is the author trying to explain here specifically about how individuals, so that's more the micro level of analysis, so how do individuals become gendered by society? That's the macro level. So what can make up society? Organizations, institutions, statuses, identities, right? But also other individuals. So in the small group, right? So whether it's in your workplace, in your family, at school, and everything is changing now, of course, right? Everything is changing because of COVID, because of this pandemic, and how so many of our interactions are taking place virtually and online. But then there are these other dimensions as well, right? So there are certain occupations where people can stay home or they can work from home, right? And this very much falls along the lines of class. So a lot of working class people are not able to work from home, right? And a lot of people who work in the service industries are not able to work from home, right? Or they are disproportionately experiencing unemployment right now, and the threat of eviction. So this is the way that we can see the micro and macro level interacting, and kind of there's a cyclical effect that happens, right? And so what does gender have to do with those things that I just mentioned? Well, the vast majority of people who work in caregiving jobs are women, right? There's an overwhelming majority of teachers, right, K through 12, that are women, right, who are definitely experiencing this pandemic in very different ways, right? And so we don't really have theories about that necessarily, but we have ones that can be extended to it. And we're going to talk about those in the coming weeks. So moving on to the next part of this definition of gender theories, right? So gender theories explain how individuals become gendered by society and other individuals, and how sex-linked characteristics are maintained and transmitted to other members of a culture. So the sex-linked characteristics, in order to understand what that means, you want to recall what we talked about last week, which was the difference between sex category and gender. So sex-linked characteristics are essentially our social and cultural associations, expectations, and stereotypes that have evolved around male and female bodies. Right, so one of the things that we talked about last week was we talked about rice and cooking and how is that related to gender and culture. Well, there are well-established norms and expectations and assumptions and stereotypes that female girls and women are going to be the cooks in the house, right? Or they're going to take on that responsibility. They're going to develop that skill set. Right, so that is an example of sex-linked characteristics, right? There's nothing about our actual sex category, whether it's our hormones or our chromosomes or our organs, that actually enables us as girls or women to cook better, right? Or to be more proficient at it or enjoy it more, right? And so that's what sex-linked characteristics means. And that's just one example. We can think of many. And so gender theories are also interested in that, right? In asking, how is it that these characteristics that are associated with sex, right? These gender stereotypes, these gendered assumptions, how are they maintained and then transmitted to other members of a culture, right? So one of the ways that this happens is through socialization, which we talked a little bit about last week, right? Another way that these are maintained is through organizations, through their practices, their policies, through written law, right? And the other way is through cultural norms and values, right? So the things that tend to be more informal but are significant, right? So when we're talking about theory, the key takeaway is to understand that sociological theories or social theories are not just opinions, right? Or not just kind of these ideas that we have about something, right? But that are based on these observations, and that we could hypothetically down the road test, right, through a research project, right, and by utilizing thought out research design. So I'm going to start with the theoretical perspective of gender essentialism and biological determinism. So if you're taking notes right now, it's a good time with like however you make a note to yourself of something being important, whether it's a highlighter or a star, you underline it, that this perspective is not the sociological perspective, right? It's like anti-sociology, right? And this perspective and the characteristics that I review here are really kind of just what this perspective is like in its purest form, right? So in its most pure form, these are the characteristics that define gender essentialism and or biological determinism as a perspective or a lens on gender differences. And so it starts with this idea that gender differences are natural, right? And so what does natural mean? Well, it can mean a lot of different things, but essentially what it is referencing is this idea that it's something that's just inside of us, right? That's where the concept biological determinism comes from, right? This perspective understands gender and gender differences to be determined at birth as a result of biology, right, and biological differences and markers and genetic. This perspective does not view the concepts of gender and sex or gender and sex category as distinct concepts, right? They're essentially understood to be interchangeable and one and the same. And overall, this perspective sees gender as something that has this essence to it, which is where the term essentialism comes from, right? It's just this idea that there's just something about girls and boys, men and women that are just different, and that we all hold these things in common, right? And so generally, this perspective doesn't view gender as something that is dynamic and that changes and responds to shifts in culture, right, or even over time. So again, these characteristics of gender essentialism very much represent the extreme form or the most pure form of this perspective. So the social constructionist perspective, which is the sociological perspective on all things within society, is represented by emphasizing how that the meanings we attach to gender, right? So this idea of femininity and masculinity and what are those things and what makes something feminine versus masculine. The main argument of the social constructionist view is that these meanings and these ideas come from people, right? They're a social product. They are socially constructed, right? It may even help to think of a literal construction, right? Like how do you put a building together, or how do you put Legos together, right? Where these are, manually being put together by people, right, with ideas in mind, right? And the social constructionists and gender theorists share that same starting point when understanding and interpreting these different phenomena throughout society that interact with gender, right? And so part of that perspective will take into consideration the ways that at different points in time, what is considered feminine and masculine will change, right? As well as across place, right? That we can easily see even today, right now in 2020, even in the middle of a global pandemic, we can see that the way that gender is represented, the way that there are gender stereotypes, right? What is considered feminine and masculine varies globally, right? And not just globally, but even within countries and within communities, right? So this is the main core argument of the social constructionist perspective. So this perspective on gender, this theoretical lens of gender, views gender as something that is active and ongoing. So the concept doing gender that you see here was coined by Weston Zimmerman, right? Who we'll be reading in a few weeks, and specifically bring in the symbolic interactionist perspective into gender and talk about the way that we display our gender and how this manifests through all sorts of little things, right? From the clothes we wear to the accessories to the way we move our bodies, our body movement, how much space we take up, right? Things of that nature. And that these things then are reproduced. Another core element to the social constructionist view of gender is that it views socialization as one of the primary ways that gender roles, gender norms, and expectations are reproduced, right? And so this socialization is essentially the process through which we learn the norms of society, right? And this will happen informally and formally. And we will be socialized by all different kinds of people, right? Of course, our family, but then also friends. Once you're school age, your school becomes one of the most important and influential sources of your socialization, right? And then as you age through and out of the school system, of course, your work environments, right? And then other extended networks that you are a part of. So the last point that I want to make about the social constructionist view of gender is that gender scholars view gender as a status, right? And specifically as an ascribed status, so one that is assigned to us. And so what that means is that for the most part, when we are out in public, right, or even watching different forms of media, whether it's TV, movies, the news, social media, right, scrolling through your phone, looking at social media posts, right, for the most part, when we see an individual, we will ascribe a gender to them, right, and for the most part, without thinking too deeply about it, right, and it's really just kind of a snap decision, and that's what it means to say that a status is ascribed, right? And so sociologists really focus on gender as an ascribed status and race as an ascribed status, which we will talk about a little bit later in this course as well, right? And what that essentially means is that regardless of how you identify, and even regardless of how you present yourself, it is going to be the interpretations of others, right, that reinforce that role of gender in your life. Right. And typically, when we're talking about different statuses that one can occupy, there are also then what the associated role is, right? So that would be the gender role, and that is the set of expectations and guidelines that the society you're a part of is generally associating with your gender.